Let me start with a little story. So back in 1999, so 15 years ago, man, that ages me. So 15 years ago, I was first introduced to the power of having a really strong supply chain management system. And not just a supply chain, but also having it integrated very well with your manufacturing and operations. And this occurred to me when I made a purchase from Dell Computer. So this is at kind of near the peak of the dot-com boom. Dell Computer was skyrocketing in size because of their quality, not only of the products they were developing, but the process that they were developing, and kind of became the industry leader in developing a high-quality supply chain that enabled them to do just amazing things with delivering products. So my story starts when I decided to go out to the Dell Computer website and custom order a computer. So I picked out all the different components that I wanted, selected this and this and this. And when I got to the end, I clicked, purchase, and I paid with my credit card. What was amazing to me was not that process of going to the website and ordering. What was amazing was that 2 days later, the computer showed up on my doorstep. 2 days later. Now, if you think about that, and today that may not seem like a big deal, but 15 years ago, you have to realize that, if you wanted a custom designed computer, that means somebody had to take the case, input all the individual components into it exactly the way I wanted, package it up, and then ship it, right? So what Dell Computer had to do was the instant that they got my order, there was somebody on the assembly line who received this order, probably within hours, who received my order, got the components, plugged them in, which, you have to make sure that all the components are there in stock, plugged them in, and then shipped them that same day because, Dell is located in Texas, right? So if they're producing this in Texas, and I at the time was living in Missouri, that's at least a 2-day drive on a delivery truck. So they had to get it done that exact same day. Now you might think, that's just all manufacturing. Well, no, it's also part of their supply chain because Dell was known as a leader at that time and was something called just-in-time inventory, which is you basically have inventory that lasts about 2 hours, so maybe more, a little bit, not usually much less, but basically you have inventory that if somehow got disrupted, that within 2 hours you would be completely out of your manufacturing process. Now that's an extremely thin, razor-thin margins on making sure that supply chain is working and that everything that you might want is available to create these products. Now, why did Dell have this, very narrow margin of inventories? Well, because every second that a high-tech item is sitting in their inventory, it's losing money, right? Because there's massive deflation in the high-tech industry. All computer components, and as you know, within 6 months to a year, a computer's already out of date, right? Well, Dell knows this too. And Dell said, all right, well, if we have all this inventory just sitting there, we're losing money because it's losing value every day it sits here. So we want to have the bare minimum in stock, but we want to have enough that we can meet all of our orders quickly. Now, what's even more amazing about this process was that Dell realized something else about, their supply chain, which was, why do they want to ship things twice? Okay, so this was the question they had. So they have a different manufacturer who actually creates the monitors. Dell doesn't create their own monitors. They actually outsource that to a separate company. But does that separate company need to ship the monitors to Dell's warehouse? And then Dell has to ship it to you when you buy something? Well, Dell said, well, that's kind of, we do have to ship things twice if we do that, so can we cut that out somehow? So they actually developed a way, and they worked very closely with UPS, so that the manufacturer of the monitors when an order is made, so when I made my order, the order actually goes to Dell and to the monitor manufacturer. The monitor manufacturer then will ship a monitor at the same time that Dell ships the computer base. UPS coordinates that so that they both meet in transit, puts them together so that way they both arrive on my doorstep at the same time. That is an amazing supply chain management system that allows that to happen and entailed a massive coordination between these companies to make it really effective. So this was back in 1999, and I really got a glimpse of just how powerful supply chain management can be. And yes, it is powered by information systems. So let's talk a little bit more about this. In particular, we're going to look at what are typical interorganizational processes, what is the supply chain, what factors affect the supply chain performance, how does supply chain profitability differ from organizational profitability, what is the bullwhip effect, and how do information systems affect supply chain performance. All right, so let's start with that first one. What are typical interorganizational processes? So you can get an idea here. So we're going back to the business processes. Let's focus on that first. Whenever two organizations make trades with each other, right, there's usually some sort of process for handling that. And this can be very simple, like when you have a credit card transaction, right? So a small retailer, you swipe your credit card on their card reader, there's a process that gets started that allows the retailer to get paid by the credit card company. All right. And so, yes, they can be fairly simple, but they can also get a little bit more complex. So, for example, when you're doing a transaction with your bank, right? So you write a check and somebody else needs to deposit that check. Well, there's actually something called the automated clearing system, the ACH. And this was actually developed back in the 1800s in England when a lot of these major banks, there's the beginning of checks, and they wanted to be able to process these checks in the most efficient manner. They found out that if they centralized this and all the banks that joined this automated clearinghouse could all participate in this check clearing process, it was a far more efficient way than sending runners between banks with IOUs and cash on hand, and which of course increases the possibility that someone will get robbed along the way carrying this money between different banks. So the automated clearinghouse was a way to manage this, and now it's all automated to the point where we have information systems that do this. But it can get very complex with customized interorganizational processing among large companies. And this can be very doing something called fulfillment, right? Now, you may not realize this, but Amazon is a big player now in fulfillment centers. In fact, you could create a company and have, that sells a product on Amazon's website, but also have Amazon fulfill it. Well, what does that mean? That means when a customer orders it, while your name is as the seller of the product, Amazon is the one who will take that product, put it in a packet, put it in a box, put a label, shipping label on it, and send it out. That's the fulfillment part. They handle that part, and they also handle returns, right? So if you want to get into manufacturing, you don't even have to have products. You don't have to do anything with the products, right? Nothing. Or just in time, the JIT. And I talked a little bit about what Dell was doing there. They're amazing with that, and a lot of companies are seeing this and trying to follow that same example. So, and these tend to be very highly complex in order to make them work effectively. Requires a lot of cooperation, a lot of negotiation and contracts, but also requires a lot of trust between these organizations that they can fulfill their side of the bargain. If you're doing something like just in time, as a manufacturer, you're highly dependent on getting your materials when they're promised. And if you don't, so if you're down to this like 2 hours of inventory, so within 2 hours you're going to be completely out of your inventory, you're very, very highly dependent upon your suppliers to keep delivering as scheduled. Because if they don't, you're going to be screwed, right? All right, so there's a lot of these very complex interorganizational processes going on. And these fit into something called a supply chain. So what is a supply chain? You can think of the supply chain as a network of organizations that facilitate the transfer from raw materials. And this could be metals, it could be plastics, it could be wood, it can be anything that's used in its raw form, that's dug out of the ground or farmed or whatever. That's the raw stuff, okay? And then you need people who can transform these raw materials through various different manufacturing. And sometimes you'll have multiple manufacturers who build, the components, and the components come together into the finished product. But even once you have the finished product that's manufactured, you need to distribute that product. And so oftentimes there's distribution centers. And then the distribution centers take it to retailers, and then retailers actually sell it to the customers. So there's this chain of companies and processes that continually add value to these raw materials until the customer can consume it. But you can visualize this as, if there's a problem at any point in this chain, it's going to impact the end consumer, right? If suddenly the raw materials are no longer available, or if there's suddenly a tsunami who wipes out some center for your main raw materials, or an earthquake, or maybe you're the raw material manufacturer, but suddenly the people you're supplying goes out of business. Well, what does that mean for you? So there's a lot of ways these can impact each other along the way. Well, is it actually a chain? Well, not really. I mean, it's better probably to think of it as a network. Or, if you're more geeky, you might say it's, like chainmail, right? Which is all kinds of interconnecting links. It's not just a one link leading down. Oftentimes you have multiple suppliers supplying multiple manufacturers, and multiple manufacturers supplying multiple distributors, and multiple distributors helping multiple retailers. And there's a lot of interactivity among that. And all of these retailers are, giving it to multiple customers. So it's actually very, very complex. And so we don't want to be misleading by making you think it's just a single chain. There's actually a lot more complexity going on here. But, so let's say, though, you're distributor number 2. What you're going to be interested in is the people that supply you and the people that you are supplying to, right? So distributor 2 is going to be interested in manufacturer 1, manufacturer 3, and a manufacturer 4. And they're going to be interested in retailer 2 and retailer 4, for example, right? And it might be actually a lot more than that. But you get the point, though, right? So they're going to have a sub-segments that they care about, where stuff is coming from and where stuff's going to. And understanding that chain linkages along the way can help you deal with any problem. So maybe you see a manufacturer, you get news that a manufacturer is having financial problems. Or maybe you hear news that a manufacturer is developing a new product. Or maybe you hear that a manufacturer is having troubles getting their raw materials. Well, this is all going to impact you as a distributor. And so that's very important for you to understand that relationship. All right. So, and what's interesting is one of the groups actually did their strategic analysis in REI. So, and this was actually, I got this slide out of the book. But REI is a retailer for outdoor recreation equipment. So you can get stuff like kayaks and skis and camping equipment, right? Well, if you're REI, though, you're going to be interested in your supply chain by saying, who are your major distributors? Who are the people that are giving you products? Now, you're going to have multiple distributors often. Okay, and these distributors are basically, you can think of them as kind of like large warehouses, but what they do, though, is they have stuff from many, many, many different manufacturers. Now, you might ask, well, why doesn't REI just go straight to the manufacturers? Well, they possibly could, but it's hard for REI to keep tabs on all the different manufacturers and what's all being created. So it can actually be overwhelming for one retailer to keep track of everything that's going on in the manufacturing industry. And so the distributor kind of consolidates a lot of products into one store, allowing the retailer to better focus in on just a few. So the distributor keeps tabs of the manufacturers and what they're doing, so the retailer can focus more on the customer and helping the customer. And essentially, that's why you end up with a lot of distributors. Distributors also help a lot with the logistics of getting stuff from the manufacturer to the retailer. And that's something that can greatly facilitate the optimization of your retail store. Now, you get companies like Walmart, and Walmart does their own distributions. So they have their own distribution centers. And some large retailers will do that, but a lot of the smaller retailers or specialized retailers prefer to work through a distribution center because it is so much easier. All right, so, but at any rate, so you kind of get the idea here. So, like the plastic supplier may give plastic to, the skis, to the pole manufacturers, and even, you say a boot manufacturer. Well, there's, the little eyelets that go on, or ignits, I think it's called, on the tips of the shoelaces. It's made out of plastic. So there's plastic that can be used in multiple different ways, or maybe you have a certain type of plastic that's being used in the sole of the boot. So it may not be all rubber, I don't know. But the point being, though, you can have multiple suppliers giving stuff to manufacturers. The manufacturers are creating certain of these products and selling them to the distributors, and the distributors then can sell those products to the retailers. Now, the customer, the end customer down there, which is you end up having to pay for this entire supply chain, right? So everywhere they add value. Now, you could go out and create your own boots, right? I mean, it's physically possible for you to do this. The problem is it would take an extraordinary amount of time and effort to do that. And not to mention, not just learning the process, but taking the time to actually do it. And then also going out and finding the actual raw materials to make your own boots, right? So in the end, you're probably saving money than having to do this yourself. However, if you buy directly from the manufacturer, yeah, you probably could save some money. But can you really keep track of all the different manufacturers out there and who all has boots and who has the best deal on boots and who has boots that are best suited for you? It would require, again, a lot of effort on your part to do the research to find exactly what you want and then to find a way to purchase this. And two, some of these manufacturers, they don't like working directly with the consumer because it requires a different kind of outbound logistics to deal with it. So if you're dealing with just a few distributors, it's a lot easier for a manufacturer than if they're having to deal with consumers, which might be thousands or even millions of consumers. And so as a manufacturer, it's you're trying to focus on just the building your product and building it the best that you can. Sometimes it's overly complex to do that if you're also working with millions of consumers, and so you tend to prefer to work with distributors. Anyway, so that's the reason why it's there. Okay, let's talk about what factors affect the supply chain performance here. So you have things like drivers, you have facilities, you have the inventory, you have transportation, and you have the information, right? That's an absolutely critical part to how you can get good supply chain performance. Now, where does information? Well, so information can help things like, so imagine information can help with transportation, right? So knowing where the supply truck should be going. And in fact, I've heard stories about how Walmart has done an incredible job with their supply chain. And that's one reason how they can keep their prices so low. But they actually work it out so that they have their own fleet of trucks, and those trucks will know not only where their distribution centers are, so they can go pick up their products, but also then deliver them to distribution centers. But then also from the distribution centers, they can take products to their stores. And then if they're on the way to a store, they might be able to pick up some new materials or new products from other manufacturers who are on the way, or maybe on the way back to the distribution center. And so they can optimize transportation, but they have to have the information, and they have to know the routes, and they have to know where their different facilities are, not only of their own facilities, their own stores and distribution centers, but of their manufacturers that they're using. And by coordinating all this with information systems, they can actually save themselves a significant amount of money. They also, if they do this well, they can impact how much inventory they actually carry. So again, if products are sitting in, you have to pay for warehouses. They're not free, and granted, they're not huge costs. I mean, warehouses can be built fairly cheaply, but there's a limit to how much you're willing to pay for these warehouses. So the better you can keep products moving from the manufacturer to the retail store, and then from the retail store out to the customer, the less inventory you're going to have to carry, which means the less warehouses you're going to need, which will increase your profitability. All right. Now, I could also talk a little bit about how question 4, which gets into how supply chain profitability differs from the organizational profitability. Because, if you think about this whole supply chain as a whole, and this is where it gets difficult, because the supply chain isn't necessarily a single chain, right? There's more of a network. But to have a very effective supply chain that's all profitable throughout, you're going to want, so I'm going to stop here for a second and backtrack. Sometimes you get some actors within the supply chain, so some of the, whether it's a retailer or a manufacturer, who tends to be very strong or very large, and they can command other people to do what they want, which can lead that particular organization to be very profitable at the expense of some of the suppliers. Now, this actually occurs very often, like in things like the car industry, right? So the big 3 car manufacturers in the U.S., so GM, Ford, and Chrysler, although Chrysler, I guess, is no longer an independent entity, but they had a lot of power over their suppliers, and so they basically would set the profitability of their suppliers and say, this is how much money, this is what we're going to pay. This is what we want you to charge your employees. And yes, they did get that specific. So they were very specific. So the profitability of the entire supply chain wasn't great, even if the big 3 were doing awesome. Right? So, but what you want to have, if you're in a supply chain, you want to be adding value as much as you can at each stage. And the more value you add, the more profitable each of those steps are going to be. And the more profitable each of these, the more people are going to, the more they're going to be able to innovate, because they're going to have more money and continue to create and provide awesome stuff. Right? So you do want to have a profitable supply chain the entire way. And if one of those steps along the way in the supply chain gains dominance and control, that can actually negatively impact the profitability of the entire chain, which can also negatively impact the innovation that comes out of that supply chain. So I think in some sense that is why, like the computer industry, one reason why it's been so incredibly powerful is that there's not been that one all-powerful company. Since IBM, that is. IBM did have that control for a while, but when a lot of the new PCs were being developed, there were so many different companies competing that it was able to ensure that the entire supply chain itself was very profitable. And that's why a lot of people went into it. All right. But let's let's go on and talk about a major problem that was been observed in supply chain. So we see this is the potential factors that impact the performance. One major problem that can happen is something called a bullwhip effect. Now, in the book, they talk about probably the most classic example of the bullwhip effect, right? And that was Procter & Gamble's observations about the diaper demand. So Procter & Gamble sells diapers. I think it's Pampers. So they sell Pampers. Now, if you think about the demand for diapers, right? At the aggregate level, so all the customers together, it should be a very steady demand, right? It's not like on the weekends, babies suddenly start using diapers a lot more, right? It's going to be consistent day in and day out, same number of diapers that are going to be demanded and used. It shouldn't vary by the season, right? Unless people start letting their kids run around naked in the summer, which they don't. But, basically speaking, it should be consistent. However, what Procter & Gamble started to observe was that the demand was fluctuating, and fluctuating far more than they expected it should. So they, from their distributors, would say, hey, we need a lot more diapers this month, but then the next month they'd say, okay, what we need this month is much less. So Procter & Gamble's having to ramp up and then ramp back their production of diapers to meet this demand. And they said, well, this is expensive, this ramping up and cutting back every other month based on this demand. Why is this a problem? Why is there this big change from month to month to month? It should be consistent. Well, what they found was that small variations in the customer behavior, so some very unrelated erratic customer demand, would actually cause a much larger fluctuations in both the distributors and manufacturers and suppliers, so that they ended up having to carry much larger inventories. Right? And what this reduces the overall profitability of a supply chain, because you have a lot more inventory sitting there that isn't being used. Right? So this was kind of what was happening here. So the retailer would see that the orders from customers would slightly change, small changes, from day to day or week to week. Well, the retailer would see this small change and like, well, I need to make sure I have enough. And they don't know if this slight variation is going to be due to, the slight variation is due to a new trend, or if it's just an erratic behavior. Right? So in order to be prepared for it, they order slightly more than what might have been normal. So that's what the distributor starts seeing. So the distributor starts seeing these slightly higher demands for products. And so they say the same thing. Well, I might need a slightly more diapers to, satisfy this increase in demand. So they bump up their order from the manufacturer. And the manufacturer sees the same thing. They're like, well, I see this increased demand from our distributors. I'm going to increase my demand from the suppliers to make sure I have enough. And then suddenly it also ramps down. And so they're suddenly like, oh, no, we got way too much now. We need to cut back. Whoa, cut back a lot. We got way too much in our inventory. And at the retailer level, it's small, but at the distributor, it becomes a much bigger drop. And at the manufacturers, even a bigger drop. And then for suppliers, even a bigger drop. Right? And so what you end up with is something called, and if you guys aren't familiar with what a bullwhip is, it's just a whip, right? And, if you take a whip, go watch Indiana Jones if you don't know what a whip is. He uses it all the time. But a small fluctuation with his wrist as he flicks the whip results in a really big and wide whip at the end. So the end of the whip flicks, sometimes, 5, 10, 15 feet, whereas all it took was, 6 inches of movement at the hand. So that's kind of what a bullwhip effect is basically saying, is that small movements at one location can end up in wild gyrations at the other end. And this is very expensive and very inefficient for the entire supply chain because it does build up excess inventory in order for them to deal with these demand changes. So how do you fix this? Well, you can fix this with with information systems, right? So now what suppliers can do, and manufacturers and distributors, they can actually see the sales from the retailer in real time. So they know exactly what's being purchased when it's being purchased. So they don't have to wait for the retailer to basically make a new order. They know what the retailer has sold, and so they can be better prepared with the materials and the products that are necessary. All right. So using information systems can help you reduce costs of buying and selling. It can increase supply chain speed. It can reduce the size and cost of inventories. It can improve delivery and scheduling, which can enable something called just-in-time. And overall, what you can do is, and I don't know why they said in the book, do not optimize supply chain profitability. Well, in effect, it does increase it, but it doesn't necessarily optimize it. It depends on how the control within the supply chain is actually impacted, but it can improve it. All right. Now, something the book doesn't talk about at this point, which I thought would be useful for you guys to hear about supply chain performance. And if you haven't read this book, I highly recommend you do. Just as much from the business side of things as anything else, which is Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Workweek. And I read this a couple years ago. But what Tim Ferriss, I mean, he owned a couple businesses, and in particular, he started selling a product. And he started realizing after a while that he's putting all this time and effort into selling his product and managing his customers that he was like, this isn't working, right? So what he did, though, was figured out how to use information systems to reduce, and not just information systems, but how to use his supply chain and work with his supply chain partners using information systems, though, to essentially automate a lot of his business, so that he usually only worked with the major problems as they developed. Most of the small problems were taken care of, and most of the business processes were automated and taken care of. And he basically said, I've automated my business enough that I can work 4 hours every week and still make enough money to really enjoy my life doing all kinds of stuff that I want to do, like travel. Now, the book itself gets a little bit into this new lifestyle that Tim Ferriss talks about. And you may not necessarily agree with it, I don't, but I like the idea behind the 4-hour work week and how to automate your business. In fact, I've heard it referred to as something called a virtual business, which is essentially you as an individual can create an entire business using your entire supply chain with just you. Right? You could hire a manufacturing company to manufacture a product. That product is shipped to a fulfillment center. The fulfillment center will fulfill all your products and deal with returns and all that stuff, will take in payments and ship the products to your customers. You can hire marketing companies to do the marketing for you, so you don't even have to do any of the marketing. You can hire everybody in your supply chain to deal with all these external facilities so that you basically have a one-person business. Now, if you do this and do it well, you could still have $1 million business with basically everything being outsourced and make a fairly decent money. Now, I've always thought it would be fun to actually try to do this, and maybe I will. Maybe that'll be my next summer project, whereas just to try to see if I can create this virtual business. Because I think it'd be... It's laid out. I mean, and Tim Ferriss basically does this in his book. He lays out how you can do that. So where you're spending minimal time selling a product and selling quite a bit of it and watching it grow and develop your income while spending very little time on it. All right. He does that using information systems to facilitate the entire supply chain. Now let that sink in a little bit for how when you go out and work in industry, what you can do to do that. And so if you get a chance to read this book, I said I recommend it just as a really interesting thought experiment on how to automate your supply chain to such an extent that you're basically you're basically just a front for the business, but you do almost nothing in it, right? So it's a virtual business, essentially. You have no direct employees. It's just you. So it's a really neat idea. And like I said, I really want to try that myself because I think it'd be kind of fun just to try to see if I can do it. And if I make some money at it too, whew, that's awesome, right? So this extension, chapter extension 10, talked a lot about supply chain and how interorganizational processes work and how information systems can help with that. So when we talked about what is the supply chain, and it's not really a chain so much as it is a network of all these businesses working together. But the factors that affect the supply chain include, transportation and, locations and, drivers and all this stuff. But you need information, though, to transfer between all these things to make it effective. And you can greatly improve your supply chain performance. And so companies have demonstrated how this can be done. The big ones like Walmart, world-renowned supply chain. Dell Computer, another world, and then a lot of other computer manufacturers have copied their supply chain process. So it's not like they're unique now, but they were Dell was the big innovator in the supply chain management. And so a lot of people, though, have copied what they're doing. So there is still, though, tons and tons of potential for improving supply chain performance. A lot of businesses are really only just barely getting started with what the potential there, right? You can also look at it, and that can increase the entire profitability of the entire supply chain so that everyone in the supply chain becomes more profitable, allowing them all to be more innovative because they have more money to be innovative and create more value for for the consumers, right? And it's not necessarily talking about one specific organizational profitability. It's about the profitability of all the companies in the supply chain. Now, the bullwhip effect is something that can greatly hinder that. And with good information systems, you can basically cancel out the bullwhip effect. All right. So that's basically the end of chapter extension 10. I did real quick want to look at chapter extension 18, talks about international MIS. And there's a question in there, question 4, that talks about how do enterprise information systems facilitate globalization, particularly the supply chain, right? And so I did want to focus on that for a bit to talk about supply chain in a global context. It's still the same concept, right? Except now, if you think about, maybe you think about these different colors representing different countries. And so you might have United States, so let's say the United States is orange, right? So you might have supplier 3, manufacturer 5, distributor 2, retailer 1, and customer 3 are all in the United States. Whereas, the light purple might be in England, right? So supplier 2, manufacturer 1, retailer 3, retailer 4, customer 2. Well, that's essentially what's happening now with this, with the increasing globalization of our entire economy, is that there are so many relationships between countries and suppliers, and it's a supply chain that it is global now. It is not by any means even close to being centralized to one country. It used to be far more, everything was done in one country. And that was part because of logistics and just made it so difficult. But now with the greatly decreasing costs, and we'll talk about that here. Let's go ahead and talk about that. So the global information systems, though, so these are new types of information, increase the supply chain profitability by, 1, it helps you to reduce your inventories. Okay, because now, so yeah, you're shipping from China to the United States. It used to be that, we didn't know what the demand was going to be for these products from China, so we would ship a whole bunch of it and hope we could sell it. Well, we don't know. So you might end up with a big, huge inventory to try to sell, and you just hope that you can do it, right? Now we can communicate across the globe, and we know specifically how much demand we have, so we can order it at a much better rate and have less inventory in stock, which also helps you mitigate the bullwhip effect, because you're able to communicate your needs to the suppliers more effectively. And producing comprehensive, accurate, and timely information allows this to happen, right? So how is this enabled? Well, globalization has greatly increased because global information systems now are extremely cheap. And we're developing a lot more standards for procedures, rules, and even how we communicate with each other with our language. So yes, English basically has become the global standard for business. However, I mean, it's not the only language that's used. It is probably the most used when it comes to business, but just keep in mind that because we have these standards, and it could change, that standard may not stay. So I don't want to, be too, too pro English when, I'm aware that with growing dominance of Chinese products and business, that there may become a time where, it would be useful to learn another language, right? But this is what global information systems enable us to do. Now, there is a slight problem with the textbook when they talk about this, so I didn't want to make it seem like I necessarily agree with this. So in his discussion on economics and the accelerator effect, he kind of screws it up. Yeah, I know. I'm going to have to trash the book again. The accelerator effect is, somewhat legit. I do have some problems with how they, on economics terms, but the way he applies it in this book is just wrong. And it was particularly, and here's a quote: if an Italian airline chooses to buy a Boeing plane, the transaction will be a cost to the Italian economy. And no, that's not right. He misses it on a couple different points. Number one, it's not a cost to the Italian economy, because the Italian economy is getting advantage of a plane that fits their needs better than other alternatives. So that is not a cost, that's a benefit. So he's completely flipped the entire concept. So that's problem number one. But problem number two is what happens? How does an Italian airline purchase a Boeing plane? Well, there's two ways. They can either buy it with euros or with dollars, right? So if they buy it with euros, that means Boeing's going to have a bunch of euros. Well, what can Boeing do with that? Well, they're going to have to send that money back over to Europe. They can't keep euros here in the US and use them, right? If they send them back, so they either have to swap currency with somebody that has that. Well, if there's a swap, that means someone in Europe has already purchased stuff with American dollars. Right, so they've already seen a growth, or sold items from Europe. So it's improving Europe. So that whole accelerator effect thing is already applying to Europe, right? Because it is sold goods. Now, it may not be particular to the Italian economy, but Europe is, especially the Eurozone, is very integrated now. So yes, that will impact Italy to some effect through the accelerator effect. So, that whole discussion there on economics is just wrong, and unfortunately, I have to correct them again because of that, which is kind of sad. But the truth of the matter is, when it comes to selling goods globally, it's actually a net benefit to both countries. We get, if Boeing sells the plane to Italy, the United States economy gets a benefit. The Italian economy gets a benefit. We both benefit because we're both specializing in what we do best. And I forget, there is actually an economic law based on that. And it escapes my mind the name of it right now. But basically the principle is, each economy should do what they do best. And if we do that, it's actually a net benefit to everybody. So it's a good thing, right? So the global information systems allow us to do that far, far more efficiently, allowing different countries to do what they can do best so that we all benefit. And then actually what it does is it brings up the standard of living of everybody around the world. And that is freaking awesome. All right, so what are some of the consequences of global information systems? Let's look at a couple companies or a couple and even jobs, right? So back in the early 2000s, Boeing talked about their project, the 77. All right, so it's a new airplane they were designing. It's supposed to be more efficient. I don't know if they still have this airline or not. What was unique about this project was that the E stand for electronic. The entire design process was going to be done electronically. They were not going to develop a prototype as what they usually did. Now, how they did this is that Boeing, they don't actually develop all the parts to the plane. They actually work with a lot of suppliers who develop different components that go into their planes. They worked with all their suppliers to also develop, to use the same information system to develop their components so that way when they put it together, they could test it all on a simulation in a computer environment, right? So here's this, Boeing, and Boeing has, suppliers throughout the world. So this was a global effort, working with all their suppliers in multiple countries, designing their plane parts. So that includes your engines, that includes their frame, that includes the seats and the dashboard for the pilots, and all the different parts were being designed and then put together electronically for a simulation to see how it would work. It was kind of the first major example for this process being done all electronically, and it was a success. So that Boeing actually started creating the plane based upon this design. All right, you're going to see more and more of that. So however complex a device it is, you don't necessarily have to create physical products necessarily anymore. It can all be done electronically and all be shared. So you're working with suppliers in multiple different countries, but you can put that together and make your designs all electronically. So this is a product development done through a global information system. All right. Another example I heard about, and this is for those of you who might want to see a reduced cost in your healthcare, right? Well, think about this type of scenario. Imagine for a minute that a really bright Indian college graduate comes to America and studies at an American university to become a doctor, right? So he goes through the program, becomes board certified here in America, and then moves back to India. So he's got all the same skills, all the same skill set that American doctors do. But he's now living in India. Well, what does that mean? Well, in India, the cost of living is much, much, much less. So in order for this doctor to have a good standard of living, he can actually charge less and still have a better standard of living in India than he would here. So you might be saying, well, that's fine if I go in to see a doctor. That doesn't, I need somebody to talk to when I go to a doctor, right? Well, not all of the doctor services require that. So think about a radiologist. So what does a radiologist do? They essentially examine x-rays. That is their primary job. They get sent x-rays, they examine them, they look for things like broken bones, or growths on bones or growths inside the body that are abnormal. They're essentially sent a picture of an x-ray. Well, that it's very easy to send pictures over the internet anywhere. So what's to stop a hospital from contracting with this doctor in India? Remember, he's board certified here in the U.S., so he's got all the same skill sets as any other doctor here in the U.S. But they contract with this doctor in India in order to read, your x-ray. Now, the hospital just saved a bunch of money by doing this, and they can pass those savings on to you because, this Indian doctor is charging less than you would here, but he's still reading the x-ray in the same manner, doing the same quality work that you would if you stayed here, right? So this is enabled by global information systems, right? The ability to send an x-ray across the world. And I'm sure it's done in a secure manner, but we can do that now, right? And we can do it in such a way that that the quality of the work is still the same, but the cost is much, much less. Now, if you think about that expanding to all different types of jobs, and essentially what's happening is a lot of jobs like this now can easily be outsourced. Because communication is so incredibly cheap in order for you to connect with people on the other side of the world. So that means everybody everywhere in the world can now compete. Now, I've seen this in web development and all kinds of programming. I've seen this in, something called virtual assistants, where, if you need an assistant, they can do stuff virtually for you, such as, place orders for you, schedule a flight for you, or buy a present for your secretary. But these virtual assistants are people that live somewhere else. It doesn't really matter where, but if they're over in a third world country where the cost of living is so low that they can charge lower rates and still do a really good job, because these people are passionate. Passionate is probably not the right word. Hungry is the right word. These people, and there's billions of them, billions of these people who are hungry to improve their quality of life. They are being educated, and now they're having the ability to learn as much as anybody here in the U.S. So they're intelligent. They are wanting to improve their quality of life, and they're willing to work for it. And not just work, 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week, but 60 and 70 hours a week. Work hard to develop over time to improve their quality of life, right? Billions of these people, which means you, when you're graduating, are no longer just competing with people here in the U.S. or even within the Greenville area if you live here. You are competing globally for these types of jobs. And this is true of everything. You can have an accountant that lives in a different country. As long as they understand the rules of the accounting rules that apply here in the U.S., well, they can easily come here, get employment, and then travel back to where they were and still be an accountant, right? They could be a certified CPA that lives in the Philippines or Thailand or Mexico or El Salvador. It doesn't really matter. They could be anywhere. But they still have the skills. And who says an accountant has to be in your office? With how cheap communication is, they can be anywhere. I don't know how many times I can reiterate that, how important this is. But the major consequence of this global information system, and this, as it applies to supply chain, though, is just as important, right? Because it's not the suppliers. It just extends out this concept. So the supply of not only the businesses you work with, but the employees you work with is now not confined nearly to the extent it used to be, right? All right, so what does that mean for you guys? Well, hopefully from this, what this means is if you want to stay competitive, both individually and as a business, you're going to have to learn how to work in a global environment, how to enable your supply chain as efficiently as you can using information systems. And as an individual, you want to become a competitor at the global scene, you're going to have to find some value added above these people that are living in other countries. So you're going to have to, and information systems are one way that you can enable that differentiation. All right. So hopefully this gives you some little inspiration for how to go about, thinking about working as you leave and leave the ECU and start your new adventures. All right, that's all I got. So take care, everyone, and until next time.